I'll let you know when we're good. We are live.
All right. Hello, people of the future. Maybe I should move my little plate of food over here somewhere.
Okay, it was outside of the camera.
All right. Well, anyway, hi everyone. As I said, I'm Patrick Lightbody from New Relic, and I've got a few slides here, but quite honestly, I think it'd be more interesting for us to talk. So especially we got a nice, small, intimate environment. So please interrupt, challenge, yell, whatever. We can take this wherever we want it to go. I just thought it'd be kind of fun for me to look backwards. Like, I'm in product management now, so I'm not really in DevOps. I will readily admit I've never used Puppet or Chef. Very good friend of mine heads the sales team up at Puppet, but that's about as close as I've gotten to it. Pretty much because by the time I stopped needing it, those things still hadn't even been invented yet. So I kind of got out of day-to-day development maybe 4 years ago. I still do some coding. So at New Relic, we have a place where our customer support people and our field sales people can put in feedback from customers, feature requests effectively. And so I wanted to organize that a certain way, and just to kind of keep myself sharp, I wrote a little application using Play and Angular. So I do a little bit of development and keep it up to date. But I kind of was excited because this is a bit of an opportunity for me to reminisce about some of my time doing DevOps-like activities, which it turns out as you do any sort of startup, you are forced to do much of that, just due to the nature of being a small resource-strapped organization. But also along the way, being in the monitoring space, I've gotten to learn a lot and participate a lot in the evolution of the market and the thinking. So I thought I'd go through a little bit of that. So I heard people already talking about it. I think most of you have probably know this book and probably have already read this book. Gene Kim, we're fortunate to actually have him nearby as a neighbor in Portland, Oregon. And so I bump into him fairly, I wouldn't say regularly, but as regularly as anyone can, since he's a very busy person. But he's a fan of New Relic. He's a fan of us. We're a fan of him. And it's nice because I've also gotten a chance to get to know him as he went through his transformation. Because, as you may know, Gene had no experience in DevOps either. Like everybody, it came to him at some point. His history was almost the opposite, right? It was in figuring out how to slow things down, how to protect against risk. His whole background was in security and compliance and risk mitigation, as opposed to embracing the risk and figuring out how to iterate faster, and recognize that the biggest risk is not doing anything. And so, Phoenix Project was part of his own evolution of figuring that out, and sharing that journey. And then my own little personal connection to him, someone already mentioned it. There it is, right there. If you look very closely, my name is in his new book. I'm super excited. I got 8 words or so in there. But it's also right next to Werner Vogel's, which I'm especially pleased about, since that's a heavy hitter right there for sure. Gene's working on a new book, the DevOps Cookbook. It's been going through some iterations, and I think you can sign up for it and get early copies of it. This is a screen grab from one of the chapters. And Gene likes that particular quote from me. It says, if you can't read it, "We found that when we woke up developers at 2 a.m., defects got fixed faster than ever." And that was a bigger part of, I was speaking at the Velocity conference a few years back, and I was sharing my personal journey from originally thinking of a startup idea to the journey all the way through to when the company was ultimately acquired, and some of the hard-learned lessons along the way. And one of them was putting ourselves on pager rotation. And so Gene seems to like that quote, and he uses it in a number of places. So I'm happy to have my little connection to DevOps, but I wouldn't claim I'm an expert. What I will share is this was my startup. It was a little company called BrowserMob. It's now part of a much larger company called Newstar, which if you're in the telco space, you might have heard of them. And still exists today, but the basic idea was it was load testing and website monitoring in the Amazon cloud in particular. If you've heard of a technology called Selenium, it was built on top of that. It's an open source browser automation toolkit. I've been involved with that project for about 10 years. And probably the most terrifying bull is that middle one there, that I bootstrapped it by refinancing. And so literally the success or failure of the business might have meant whether I was going to live in my house anymore or not. And so it was a really terrifying time, especially because the way the product worked is we would scale up literally thousands. In one case, we did 10,000 EC2 instances and smash someone's website with them and then programmatically turn them down. And oh, by the way, we allowed people to sign up by credit card anytime, 24/7, and run it themselves. And so I would wake up in the middle of the night, like really like in a cold sweat, wondering, did a customer just come on board, run a test, and then did my systems fail to turn off the machines? Because I'm the one that carries that cost.
Is it like Sosta? Or is that a competitor?
Sosta was a competitor, and I'd like to think that I influenced some of their behaviors and whatnot. So yeah, I know the Sosta guys very well. Yes, this was a self-service Sosta, and cool. You know, it's that last part of the risk associated with the machine logic and the machine automation that really kind of got me to fully appreciate DevOps. And you know, the scarcity of resources, the real personal experience of me, you know, possibly losing all of my entire life savings if I, you know, went on vacation and didn't realize that there were, you know, thousands of machines eating up. I mean, you know, 1,000 machines at 8 cents an hour, $80 an hour if you're gone. Like I did during this trip, or during this time, I went to Europe for a week, and I was somewhat detached from the business for a week, and I was just thinking, like, what if at $80 an hour, only a week could blow me out? Like that could just kill me. 24/7. Wow. So I learned to what Gene was referencing was a lot of the lessons I learned and shared at Velocity. You know, and I won't go through all of them here, but was the critical nature of integrating your operations into the actual development. So you know, we had Twilio calls and then later PagerDuty calls directly natively inside of the software. Both the actual software we were running in case something, you know, unexpected happened in the application logic, but then also, of course, separate monitors that were on separate systems that were fault tolerant. Because yeah, I mean, it would break the business if we didn't handle some of this capacity right. And so that's kind of how I got into it in the first place. And I figured I'll just go through and share some of the more recent things I've been doing now. Yeah, please, you know, stop me as we go through this. So what I do today is I work at New Relic, and this is probably the product that we're most well known for. It's our APM product. It works on all the major app server programming languages, integrates right in, and I'll actually talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I like to think about what are some of the common trends that you see from a really good operations team, regardless of whether it's, you know, they're embracing DevOps or not. But I'll come back to this term software operations in a second. But when I go and I see a team that's really kind of got it honed in, there's three common things they're always thinking about, and these are not big surprises, right? Performance, availability, and functionality. Those are the three things that ultimately matter to the customer. You know, I suppose there's elements of, you know, value that matters. There's other elements too, but that's more of the business, right? But when it comes to delivering, you know, great software, whether it's a website or a mobile application or a video game or whatever, right? It's gotta perform well. It's gotta be available when you want it, and it's gotta do what it's supposed to do. And New Relic has been doing this for a while, I would say. We've got coverage in all of these areas, and in particular with our APM product. But through as a product manager who provides products and builds products in that the world of DevOps uses, how we think about our portfolio of products and how we've been evolving it. I think it's part of an interesting topic on DevOps. So, in the area of performance, as I mentioned, we've historically focused on backend applications, basically all the main programming languages you can think of. And so we're seeing all of the transactions that are coming into those systems. And that's a pretty good way to see the performance of your application. Well, actually, just in case you haven't seen New Relic, this is kind of some of the kind of graphs you're seeing. So this is for a Ruby application. We break it down by how much time is being spent in the database, how much time is being spent working with caches, that kind of stuff. And it's pretty useful. Oops, there's some of the transitions are a little off. Also get databases and things like that. But where performance starts to become a problem is when your actual users are touching it. The performance, right? A transaction to render a screen, render the root HTML, isn't the full story. That HTML then references style sheets and images and JavaScript that might be hosted on your own infrastructure, might be hosted by third parties. And so the story gets more complex as you introduce browsers and mobile devices. And that was where New Relic really realized that we had to evolve the tooling that we provide in the industry to keep up with the evolution of the industry, right? If you think, just think 10 years ago. 10 years ago, Ajax, I don't even know if that was still a term. It might have just been getting coined as a term. Certainly, there were no rich native mobile applications except for maybe some BlackBerry apps. iPhone wasn't invented and certainly didn't have the App Store. Android was a few years after that. The world that we lived in even just 10 years ago was very different in terms of software complexity. And I kind of want to go back to the sort of so what when it comes to the software operations angle, because for a long time as this sea change was happening, what I noticed is the weaker software operations teams kind of took the mentality of, well, yeah, but that's all out of my data center. It's not my problem. And I'd say that's a very much pure operations mentality as opposed to a DevOps mentality. An example, the simplest example, it would be a third-party tweet this button or like this button or +1 button, right? And an ops person, a historical pure play ops person might have said, yeah, but we don't control the network that hosts that button. That's Google or Twitter or Facebook. So what do I care if it's going slow or not? Whereas, of course, at DevOps, someone who's embraced DevOps culture would say, oh, but we can, of course, pull that button from the site. We can choose to find a different button. We can build our own button. We don't have to rely on just the constraints of the way the software is packaged today. And so there's operational considerations and there's the actual actions you can take that aren't always just pure network considerations. So New Relic, looking kind of at where we evolved, we started doing backend app servers. We then added more recently our browser product, which is all about looking at what's going on the edge of the boundary of the application. More recently, we also did a mobile APM product. But the problem is that there's still a whole bunch of stuff, like the cloud, that is outside the boundaries of what New Relic was really solving. We've done our best to sort of expand the coverage as best as we could, meaning our APM product initially didn't track across all of the different tiers of your application, and so we added features to do that, and so we helped address some of the service-oriented architecture pain points. We expanded out our ability to see what the different assets were that were on the page, but we didn't really cover it all, and some things were kind of left unaddressed. And I'll I'll come back to what we're doing about that. But that's kind of the way we think about performance. There's lots of different performance angles, some of which our products address, some of which they don't. But the other big problem is that all of New Relic's products are about assessing the performance and experience of real users. And as we know in the real world, people are crazy. There's a lot of them, and they're different, and they all have different behaviors, different expectations. And some of them literally go through subways. And I mean that in the sense that when you're looking at real user data, and it's inherently noisy. Like literally, those people on that subway who are loading up websites, your websites, and then running through a subway tunnel, their internet connection drops. And then it comes back. And then it reports like a 4-minute page load time, right? That's the noise of the real world. Everyone's on different devices, different network providers, different carriers. They're doing different things with their computers. Some of them have malware on their computer. It's inherently a noisy environment. And so as a software operations team, your job is to try to interpret that noise and figure out, is there a problem going on or not? But of course, what it can help that is to complement it with a cleaner room style of monitoring. And as kind of going back to as a product owner and product line manager for New Relic, this was an area that we were hearing from our community, in particular from DevOps enthusiasts, that we were really lacking, that we didn't have the ability to help our customers see a much more consistent unit of measure of their page performance. So this is foreshadowing something. Next one up is availability. This is Nagios. Probably lots of you have looked at or seen or used Nagios at some point in the past, or some commercial product from HP or Microsoft or a number of other vendors. That's a good way to do basic availability monitoring, make sure something's online. In fact, New Relic has had availability monitoring at a basic level for many, many years, where you could give us a URL and we would monitor it, check that it returns the right HTTP status code, et cetera, and alert if there were any problems. Problem with availability monitoring is it really was only checking kind of a couple specific areas. Was your application up that you own? Was certain hosts that you're looking for? But it couldn't actually check whether the entire flow end to end was working. And that relates to, and then also, of course, it couldn't check from all over the world. Our availability monitor, in our case, was only seeing from one location. And that matters especially in really complex environments where you got multiple data centers, DNS-based load balancing, or even just the inherent network topology that's ever changing, right? Someone down the street might smash into an electrical pole and change the way the internet's routing. And so there's an element of availability that's more complicated than basic Nagios from behind your firewall or simple New Relic. Is it responding to a ping? And then the last one, functionality. This one's, I think, kind of the most interesting, especially from a DevOps perspective. Functionality is a very complex topic. New Relic has, for many years, had error reports. So this is a screenshot of what that looks like, where we see and report on all the different ways that your application is failing. Here, grouping in this case by the Rails action controller and the different exception type, and then telling you how many times it's been happening, when it first happened, when it last happened, integration into bug trackers, et cetera, et cetera. But then equivalently, we've got something similar on the front end with JavaScript error traces, as well as on the mobile devices in terms of mobile crashes. But it's always been about uncaught exceptions. What are the actual exceptional things happening inside of the software application stack? And the problem is that not all failures are uncaught exceptions. I think we've probably all been there at some point where you've either done it yourself or you've been part of a project that pushed out a release that just had a boneheaded bug in it, right? I always think of the example like some critical function that should have returned true and somebody changed it to false as they were debugging something and then committed it by accident, and then it made its way into production. My own personal story of something like that was one time I was trying to order a rug on Costco.com, and I'd gotten all the way through. This is a couple of years ago, all the way through to the checkout experience on the final checkout page, and I clicked, confirm purchase, and I'd entered everything in, and nothing was happening. And I because I'm somewhat still a technical dork, I fired open the Chrome Dev Tools, and I looked, and there were no JavaScript errors. There were no AJAX requests going out. Like, literally nothing was happening. And I started debugging the problem, and I found that there was an event listener using jQuery registered on that button. So I was wondering, why is it not firing? And I looked a little closer, and I noticed that the page was including a version of jQuery called, the file name was jQuery, I think it was .latest.js. What that means is they were symbolically linking to a site that hosted the latest version, and it just so happened that earlier that night a new version of jQuery came out that had a breaking change. So they didn't touch anything. They had done nothing to their application. They hadn't deployed anything. They probably hadn't changed their hardware in any way, but because a developer at one point linked to a public CDN that was hosting that version of jQuery and chose to point it to always the latest version, something broke. And there was no way that real user monitoring could possibly cover that kind of thing, because there was no exceptional event being fired out. There's no JavaScript error. There's no backend error or anything like that. And so there's an element of, you want to, I think a strong operations program in place also needs to be testing the happy path for functionality on a somewhat regular basis.
Did you get your rug?
What's that?
Did you eat your rug?
Eventually, yes. But I had to go back like the next day. There were people on Twitter complaining about it too, so I wasn't the only one. I did get my rug. I have, he left, but I also have little kids, and so my rug needs replacement soon. They're tearing it up. Testing the happy path, I think, is another element that doesn't get enough attention. And so, it's good to see in a lot of agile shops, automated testing. You mentioned Team City. I do hook in Selenium tests as part of that build. Yep. The thing I'd say is that the only problem is that if it's all, most of the functional testing work has all been focused on the build time. But software is so complex now, where everything's being pieced together at the last second in the user's environment. There's a healthy practice is to do at least some testing all the time, because otherwise you would have caught the jQuery latest. Now there's an element of how much do you do. You don't want to. It can be a very expensive proposition to run automated functional tests all the time, because you need machines to do that. And so my advice would be to run a small number of functional tests. The ones that are the most critical to the business or the application, and run it at a fairly limited frequency, not once a minute or anything like that, but maybe every 15 or 20 minutes. But anyway, that's an element of the kind of the three pillars. Coming back to this picture, we built a product to solve these problems because we realized that our current products weren't still providing all the right coverage. So we launched a product last November called Relic Synthetics, which is a Selenium testing in the cloud service. Not for functional, I wouldn't say it's for your QA environment. It's not like we go and take your entire test suite and run it on 18 different browsers. It's very much focused on the operational concerns that I just called out, especially the functionality and the clean room performance. This isn't here to be a pitch of the New Relic products, but more so to underscore how nuanced you have to be when you're considering a really good operational process, and that it's fundamentally intertwined with the complexities that developers are wrestling with on a daily basis, right? You're a major e-commerce website going down and unable to process revenue because of a jQuery include, right? I mean, everybody should care about that, and I think that's kind of the fundamental story. And as a result, there is no one tool that's going to do it. We hope New Relic will provide most of the tools as time goes on. But if you're only, I can just guarantee you, if you're only using New Relic, you don't have coverage everywhere, because we don't provide all the tools. and and there's a multitude of them, and I'll cover a few more here in just a second, that make up a really sophisticated operations process.
Mm-hmm. Are you open for questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So a few other concerns that you didn't call out, like one would be my database is getting hammered. It needs an index on a column. And in New Relic, from what I know of it, that's not a really natural thing to be database centric. It's more natural to be transaction centric.
Mm-hmm.
And a second use case would be my data center on the East Coast has worse performance than my data center in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, maybe it's hardware related. Maybe the SAN is acting up, or the switch is acting up in this particular data center, as opposed to another data center. Yeah. And when you look at New Relic, it's not hardware oriented as much as it's application oriented, at least from an outside perspective. So what about those two use cases, and how do they relate to your product strategy?
Yeah, so this actually isn't all of our products. We also have a server monitoring capability, and also column plugins. It's part of a kind of a broader platform that does some additional database monitoring. But you're absolutely right. There's lots more concerns than just New Relic can provide. Most of our perspective is transactional from the perspective of the software application. So in the case of database, we do see slow database calls, and in fact, we'll even run an explain plan on a slow query and report it back to you. But that's only part of the story. Again, it's kind of same theme, but now we're talking more at like systems level. Sometimes the explain plan will be really obvious. You're missing an index. You should add an index, right? But sometimes the explain plan will say, boom, we went straight to the data, and it was the fastest it was going to go, but it took 45 seconds. And you're just left scratching your head, what the heck's going on? And in those cases, the context of just the software calling the database is not enough, because what you don't know when that kind of stuff's happening is that there's 800 other applications talking to the database, and the disk is just ground to a halt, right? That may be one example of it. And so strictly looking at it from within the software doesn't tell you the whole picture. We're working on expanding that out. That's why we built our server monitoring product and our platform plugins capability to provide some of that additional context. And we think it's getting better and giving more and more of that context. But again, you got to look at these things from 12 different perspectives to really get the full picture.
Yeah, I've used those actually, and they're pretty awesome. But if you're looking at an operations team that is looking at thousands of nodes, they're just going to look at that functionality and think that it's not what they are looking for. And so what you have is developers on one side that are kind of looking at it where your presentation has been so far from sort of the outside looking in, and you have from the top down, if you want to look at it that way. And then you have pure operations people who are looking more from the bottom up of what the hardware is doing and what the database is doing, and they sort of disagree on what they want out of monitoring.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair, and we hope to continue to bridge that gap further and further. But we started much more developer-centric, application-centric, and you're correctly observing that. One of the things that I think is probably the great equalizer in the industry right now is the cloud.
Yeah.
A lot of those low-level operational concerns go away, and the developers end up speaking a common language that they can get together with operations on. And so what we've seen is that with this really large shift to the cloud, and not everyone's using it, but a ton of our customers are, there's an opportunity for us to kind of reset the conversation. And so what I would say is expect to see some stuff from us that's more operationally friendly and more about the infrastructure, but probably more focused on cloud than say how your SAN is doing.
Yeah, I think that's a solid business strategy on your part. just sucks when you don't
When
have,
you've got a SAN.
when you have a data center
Yeah,
that has
yeah.
a SAN that's,
Yeah.
needs.
Does that mean things like Cloud Foundry and stuff like that, where you'd be?
Possibly. Certainly Amazon,
Mhm.
Azure, Microsoft, Google, Cloud Foundry's pretty popular.
Mhm.
IBM's got some stuff they're pushing out. So, limited number, but mostly public cloud. And yeah, when it comes to the the really low-level DBA tooling or traditional network and infrastructure monitoring, there's a lot of products out there, and it'd be hard for us as a business strategy to go compete with all them, especially as the landscape's being sort of upended, right now. So yeah, we think cloud and Docker also is another one of those that's kind of changing the way people are thinking about things. Let me move on. I've got a few other things. So yeah, we built this product to kind of address the performance, availability, and some functionality. But I want to kind of cover a few other points. So you stole my word, collaboration. But I think I think the other key thing I've observed is that this is a team sport, right? It's all about collaboration. Even if it's not DevOps, just traditional ops, when it's working best, it's almost a measure of not how fast you can, mean time to resolution or mean time to response. It's mean time to collaborate. How quickly can you get the right people? Not just anybody. Of course, you can get anybody on a phone or on a, in a chat room. But how quickly can you get the right people to come in and start talking through the problem and figure out mitigation strategies? Because sometimes it's not resolved. Sometimes it's, deflect or reduce impact. And sometimes the only person that knows is that one developer who's intimately knowledgeable of that software. So I believe that DevOps is a big part of it is that deep sense of collaboration with the rest of the business. In terms of tools, other tools, I mentioned there's lots of other parts of the DevOps ecosystem. I think these are 5. Actually, one of them, the one in the middle, is technically New Relic now, but are 5 that we see pretty commonly in the market. So I'm just curious, any Slack or HipChat users? Slack. HipChat. Nothing?
Oh yeah.
Oh, you got to get on the chat train.
Yeah, gotta be
chat
focused.
Yeah.
That's right.
No, this is just actually earlier today we had an event, and one of the customers of ours talked about how important HipChat chat rooms are to them, and Slack similarly, where this becomes the virtual meeting place, and for these operations teams, they're basically like old IRC chat rooms. Like there's nothing super fancy with it. They're just more accessible. They're mobile friendly. They've got nice desktop clients, and most importantly for DevOps, they have integrations so that every time you do a pull request on GitHub, a little bot comes in and tells everyone, oh, there's been a pull request, or there's been an alert in New Relic, or we just did a deploy. So I bet TeamCity has integration into HipChat, almost certainly. And so as part of that collaboration, like at New Relic, all of our people who care about a deployment, they'll get in the same chat room, and then they can see everything that's going on, everything from where in the build for inside of the continuous integration tools is the deploy happening to are we getting any alerts after the deploy. And then on the bottom there, PagerDuty, VictorOps, there's a few other vendors in the space, but those are 2 of the most interesting ones. These are the on-call escalations. This is what I was referring to when Gene quoted me on waking people up at 2 in the morning. PagerDuty, you use PagerDuty? Anybody use PagerDuty?
Actually, we use Ping.
Ping, oh yeah, they've got their new Beep Manager, I think is what it's called. That's right.
We use VictorOps.
VictorOps, good. Well, that's good to hear, actually. They're a new company based out in Boulder. Great team, yeah. So yeah, it's all about, for those of you not familiar with them, they're simple on-call rotation management software. Who's up tonight. They can get fairly sophisticated, like follow the sun schedules and things like that. But ultimately, it's about when there's a problem, send an alert to PagerDuty. PagerDuty will call the first line person, and if that person doesn't answer within a few minutes, call the next person, and the next person, and the next person.
Check the guy, see if he has a pulse.
Yeah. I mean,
wearable.
it's like you're not going to check your email at 3 in the morning. You're sleeping, right?
Mhm.
And you're probably not even going to wake up from a text message. You need something to annoy the hell out of you to get you out of bed. And that's what PagerDuty's good at, right? It can call multiple phone numbers. So like I had it set up, I was so paranoid because it was like my entire house was on the line. I had it set up to call my cell line and my landline. And so my wife loved it because it would like wake us all up at 2 in the morning. But it was super important. And so, similarly from a collaboration angle, I would recommend these be part of the overall portfolio. And I put Duxboard in there, and there's a few other dashboarding like vendors, but Duxboard is special to us because we like them so much. We acquired them last October. We'll be relaunching that product later this year as New Relic dashboards. But dashboarding, of course, is a big component of collaboration. It's sharing information, radiating information around the office or inside of an operations center. And so it becomes really important to be able to quickly piece together certain dashboards. I think a common misconception is that dashboards are static. Once you put one up, it's going to stay there for the next 10 years. And I try to encourage people to switch it up like almost daily if necessary, depending on the task at hand. If you're about to go into a big deploy, maybe the dashboard that you have on 24/7 isn't the dashboard you need right now. Maybe you need something entirely different for the deploy that's pulling in, the deploy lifecycle information from, say, Team City. Anyway, those are just some of the other things in the ecosystem, and of course there's a whole bunch more like Chef and Puppet, but I wanted to focus on the collaboration part. And we're not without our own collaboration. This is a real screenshot from one of our site reliability engineers. He doesn't know that I've pasted some of his text up there, but he didn't say anything bad. So we have a capability in New Relic called Notes, where you can take any graph you see in the product and add it as a note, and then write some text up with it. And in this particular case, you can see it was on February earlier this year, and we noticed suboptimal routing, and he started adding up. There was a bunch more. I just screen grabbed one of them, but a whole bunch of graphs and typed up information about it, and then could share the note, by sending it by email or opening an actual ticket in different ticketing systems, or just pasting the link right into HipChat, for example. So that's a good way to collaborate, but also have it with the contextual graphs that are necessary to pull together, the dev side of the house and the operations side of the house. All right. So the other thing I've learned along the way, as a product owner and then also as a developer, this whole move to microservices is really, really hard. The term's gone by a whole bunch of different terms. Before that, it was service-oriented architecture, and now they've just become even smaller little services, so now they're microservices. Things like Docker have definitely made it easier to build very isolated pieces of software, and deploy them quickly and have them interconnect with each other. But they're hard from a collaboration standpoint and an operations standpoint, because it's really difficult to tell when there's an end user problem happening. Who's at fault really under the multitude of dependencies? And if you were to just map out all of those dependencies, you end up looking with something like this, with a sufficiently complex architecture, where everything's kind of ultimately talking to everything else, and it's hard to make heads or tails of it. Half of them might be red, but which one's the one that's causing all the rest to be red? And so we at New Relic realized that part of the mapping and the topology, which is such a hugely important part of operations, because that's all about triage and understanding the big picture and zooming in, we figured out that that part of the problem is that it's not strictly a map that you render programmatically. We've had a mapping capability in our product for a number of years. This is a real map of our own application, but we've always had challenges with it, and from a design standpoint, because if you put too many things in, right, you just get that huge mess of nodes. And what we realized, our big aha moment, was that drawing out things is a form of collaboration and communication, right? When you see an architectural diagram, it's not just the state of the system for the sake of it, right? It's trying to communicate to you, the developer, you, the operations person, how this information flows together. And there's always some element of artistic license that comes into play. Right? I mean, we've all done it. You're on a whiteboard, you're drawing out your architecture, and then you draw a box, and you sort of do this hand-wavy thing, and you're like, oh yeah, and that's that other system, and you dismiss it, when in reality that other system is itself a giant hairball of stuff. But it's not important, it's not relevant for this conversation, so you just sort of box it off and don't really draw it out. And we realized that there needs to be more tooling in the monitoring and system management space that's interactive and isn't just about showing you the way the system works, because you inevitably get to a big goop of interconnected points. So this is actually a screenshot of a feature where we haven't even released yet, so you're getting a sneak peek preview of it, that allows you to incrementally add new nodes. You don't have to draw the connections. That's architecture that we already know, because we see the software talking to other bits of software. You don't have to tell us the state, red, yellow, or green. We know that too. The calls per minute, things like that, right? But what you do need to say is whether something's important to you or not, or the purpose of this particular exercise you're going through in understanding your architecture. And so you can actually go and delete some of these nodes and just say they're not relevant. Or you can take a few nodes and collapse them off to the side and say they're just all grouped together and not relevant for this conversation, but I want to roughly see them. And you can save these and then come back to them later, and we'll tell you when you come back later, oh, 3 new things have popped in. Do you want to see those too, or do you want to dismiss them? So we've kind of come to the conclusion that there's an element, there's this whiteboarding interaction that happens every day inside of offices, but as DevOps is becoming more virtualized in environments like Slack or HipChat, you need to have virtual whiteboards to be able to really fully communicate. And we think that this is something we're going to see a lot more of in a lot of the tooling that's out there. All right, I think I'm getting near done. So the other big thing I've learned along the way is that complexity is exploding, of course, but it's also found its way in probably some of the most complex ways all the way to the edge of your application, well beyond the zone of any of your control. That example of the rug is one of the simpler examples of that complexity of JavaScript making, right? But the complexity is much more than that now. Obviously, with a native application, right? It's a full-blown compiled application that's 5, 10, 15, 100 megabytes that's being loaded onto your mini computer in your pocket and is doing 3D graphics, doing local database access, it's talking to third parties, and most of the time you have no idea what's actually happening in that environment. Similarly, on the browser side, there's local databases in browsers now. You can get access to local caching systems. There's 3D graphics as well. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's making it really, really hard to know whether your application is successful or not. Fortunately, anyway, so we built a product called New Relic Browser that helps with that. But I want to go into, these are actually some slides from last night. I'm glad none of you attended the JavaScript user group, because otherwise this would be a bit of a repeat. But I did a session at the Dallas JavaScript users group of 10 new specifications that W3C is working on that are showing up in browsers. And I'm going to do some of them, not all of them. In particular, I want to do the ones that are network related, because that's probably the one that both developers and operations care about intimately. So one of the specs that's widely supported now, you can see all the browsers supported. It's been in since IE9 and a few revs ago of Android, as well as all the other browsers which are more evergreen and auto-upgrading. Navigation timing is an ability. It's a JavaScript API for your software or New Relic software, as the case may be, to ask that page load for that user the timing of how long did it take for the page to finish its DNS lookup, how long did it take for the onload event to fire, the DOM complete event to fire. Pretty key, not a ton, but some key metrics that help you better understand the user's experience. And of course, the so what question usually comes up is like, well, what can I do about that? You can do quite a bit. You can choose to put your assets on a CDN. You can choose to upgrade your capacity. You can choose, from a developer or product standpoint, to have fewer assets on the page. There's a whole bunch of things you can do that intersect development and operations that can affect page load. But it hasn't stopped there. There's actually quite a bit more that's being added. You can see now resource timing is in IE10, and one of the more recent versions of Android, as well as some of the browsers, unfortunately not the Apple browsers. Resource timing goes a step further and allows me to ask not just how the page load was, but how all the individual assets on the page were loading. So the images, the JavaScript, the CSS. There's some quirks with it. In particular, it doesn't tell you the total file size of the asset or the response code, because there were some concerns early on about whether that would be a potential security violation. For example, if you know something's a 1 byte 400 response, then you might know that that's a certain level of authentication status, and that could possibly be an attack vector. Turns out that concern ended up not being too much of an issue, and they're actually going to add that in newer versions of some of these specs. But again, like helping you, I want you to know that even though this complexity shifted out there, there's all sorts of new telemetry data that's available, either through commercial services like New Relics or just on your own. You can write JavaScript that pulls this data out and does something with it. There's also user timing, which is a standardized way to put markers and measurements inside of the performance metrics that the browser's collecting. I expect that we'll start to see lots of JavaScript frameworks use this as a standard interface. And then, of course, you can put your own logic in there as well. So if you've got a rich web application, you can measure at a very detailed level what's going on. Right? I mean, a lot of DevOps is about telemetry, but for whatever reason, most developers who especially have been doing this for a while their thinking stops at telemetry behind the firewall. But this is complex software, right? You're shipping megabytes and megabytes of JavaScript down to end users. Why don't we care about that? We should, and fortunately, the industry seems to be that we are, and is making it possible. Of course, you got to get all that data back, and so there's also a new spec that makes it possible to beacon some of that analytics data right back to your own servers. This isn't supported across all the browsers, and there are workarounds. Basically, you can measure on unload is an event in the browser. You can fire off an AJAX event, but it's not nearly as reliable as Beacon is going to be. Beacon's great because it means that it will even send the data well after you've left to another page, or maybe even you've quit the browser and brought it back up. It has much better durability in getting those items back to you. But the one I'm most excited about, unfortunately, is the furthest out from being a real standard in any browsers. But it is a W3C spec they're working on, is network error logging. This one is super cool, and just I think will help unlock some of the ideas and the way where the industry is going. What it is a special header, works at the protocol layer, where you can send back. You can see this example here, an NEL response header, and give it a beacon URL. This is actually a bad example. The text right below example 1 in the spec says this is a bad example. The reason it's a bad example is it's a relative URL. So it's saying report network error issues to example.com/report. The problem is if example.com is not working, say there's a DNS failure or network connectivity failure, the beacon can't send it anywhere. So a best practice in the spec is to have an entirely separate host or even just an IP address where you can get some of this information. But what it's basically doing is it's telling the browser, it says, hey browser, anytime there's any additional network problems that you see in the future, until I say otherwise, including a DNS resolution problem or a connection issue, anything where there's no JavaScript, there's no HTML, there's nothing that can possibly you can send in terms of code, but there's still a problem for the end user. Anytime that ever happens, send a standardized payload about that error to this beacon URL. And so it's a way for operations teams to start, for the first time ever, being able to measure things like what's the DNS failure rate across my users. I mean, there's at a much lower level layer of the networking stack than we've ever had access to before. So I'm excited about it. It's definitely a little ways out, but I think it's a good example of the opportunities that are going to be opening up, which are super important because the complexity is already here. And like I mentioned, we also do this for mobile devices. This is actually my last slide. And mobile is just as complex. We've seen scenarios where people have applications that get into these really strange states where they crash one time, and they're mobile applications writing data, and it crashes in a way where the data is not completely written out into its local file system effectively. And then when they launch the app back up again, the user, we all had that, app goes, crashes out. Well, then you try launching the app again, and the software they wrote reads that file out, and it sees an unexpected end of file, and then crashes again. And so a crash starts a vicious cycle of crashing, and the user, of course, gives up on you and uninstalls and moves on. And you never knew, right? Without any sort of crash reporting service, New Relic has one, there's other companies that do it as well, without any sort of service to help you understand that, your users just churn away, they put a bad review on your app store, you never know, right? I think even the more nefarious one, or the one that, not nefarious, but is a better example even of that sort of integrates the operation story, is what if that file that's being written out is actually content from a server, right? So now how your server is behaving, it might have written out 200 OK and written out a response body, but if it was fragmented because of an application error or because of a network glitch, it's sending these streams all the way down to mobile devices, and now it's basically remotely crashing and killing your users, and you've got no insights into it because if your visibility stops at the firewall. And so again, it's really complicated, and it's a bit terrifying at times, but it's also I think a bit exciting because there's lots of tooling and telemetry options that are making themselves available. So that's it. That's the session. I guess I ended 9 minutes early, but love to hear your thoughts or questions. All I got. Does all that make sense, or am I speaking crazy?
I think I cut you off on the synthetics thing. So basically, the synthetics is you were sort of hinting at it being agents throughout your infrastructure, which tests certain elements of your infrastructure. Is that right?
That's right. And again,
future thing?
That's just one technique, of what should be a large, well-balanced meal, right? I wouldn't recommend anybody use any one of these tools just by themselves. But what that one in particular does, and it's available today, we launched it a few months ago, is from a number of locations around the world, takes a Selenium test and runs it repeatedly, and ensures that critical functionality passes on a regular basis.
Okay.
Just kind of fun fact, since we're in a DevOps group and Docker's, I think, probably a relevant topic. Every time those scripts run, we accept code from our customers. And so, we have a few other security tricks and things we put in place because Docker isn't a foolproof way to do security isolation. But we do run our Selenium test in a Docker container. And so, today we're running hundreds of millions of Docker processes every day because of that. So it works well for us.
Yeah, that's great.
Docker and Node, we got two buzzwords in one. It's awesome.
Good.
Other questions?
Okay.
Cool.
Enjoy
Yeah.
it.
Thank you.